So the joke that I'd like to talk about is I just kind of asked one of my coworkers what a lot of Japanese people joke about that might be considered offensive to American people, and one of the things they said is like when someone does something or says something that's considered gay, they'll like put a hand motion like this and say, "Are you on this side?" Referring to like, "Are you on the gay side?" And it's a very clearly heteronormative joke, suggesting that there's like some kind of divide between straight people versus queer people. And I think the point of difference and conflict is just that in America, there's definitely a more careful and uh, sort of like uh, I think more nuanced treatment of misunderstanding about queer identity that isn't as prevalent in Japanese culture that I think causes that joke to definitely not be acceptable in America, at least in the communities that I'm like a part of, especially like being on a college campus. Um, but to answer the second question about like noticing cultural sensitivities, I actually think it's quite difficult, and I haven't really come across any large cultural sensitivities. Partly because I think noticing cultural sensitivities requires kind of like someone to bring up something that you said that was offensive, and I think that doesn't come up a lot. Partly because of language barriers. For example, when someone says something that I think is off, I don't usually try to explain to them why I think it was problematic or the point of like cultural difference because of language barriers. And I think it's something that's so complex and hard to understand, even within a particular language, that trying to tell that to someone from a different culture is usually like not worth the time and kind of the seriousness that you would want to bring into like a very casual conversation. So I've noticed that a lot of these cultural sensitivities tend to be kind of like suppressed, just in casual conversation, especially at work. Um, but to talk more about American politics and political correctness in the U.S., I think I think definitely political polarization is something that has really like created PC culture and accelerated PC culture, and I think uh, Rosaldo's essay that discusses basically how like there's relativism between different cultures. I've noticed that it happens even across the political spectrum within the U.S. that there's such different ways in which people are brought up and culturally conditioned. For example, in urban cities versus like somewhere in the Midwest, that those kinds of like ignorance, I guess, and refusal to even like consider others people's beliefs happens even within our own country, not even across, I guess, like national borders. Um, but so my thoughts on this are that definitely I think PC culture is bad and that there's use in having discussion, and I think it accelerates political polarization. I definitely agree with the Zizek interview where he talks about how we're sort of like trapped in our hatred, is that PC culture doesn't allow people to discuss their points of difference, but rather certain people are forced to not sort of like voice their opinions, even though they might come up from a place of sort of like misunderstanding. Um, for example, like if I think this comes across a lot with like ableist terms, such as the word dumb or like the R word, is that people use them, but they really don't understand why people consider them ableist or like what is the history that causes those words to sort of create forms of exclusion. And for that reason, when they're considered PC and they're not allowed to say them anymore, people feel misunderstood and at least confused. And I think that causes a barrier to be created where discourse isn't happening and people continue to kind of have their own beliefs. And that's when people pass the most judgment on other people that creates forms of difference and I guess like political disagreement. Um, what Obama said is very true, which is I think we should is that like there's always something to be learned from a culture or from an experience or from pieces of information that we might personally find offensive, but learning that information and understanding where other people come from is still useful, even if it's not something we agree with. Part of as just like a marketplace of ideas, and I think this is where humor plays a really important part. Is that getting to get people to listen, I think requires what Sally Cohn talks about, which is creating an emotional connection where you can trust another person and begin to listen to them as a person before as like a political opponent. And I think humor does that because humor sort of touches at something that we all feel and that we can like feel emotionally, i.e. like we will laugh at something and we can't control that. And I think that, for example, poking fun at something like that we consider PC is a type of humor that a lot of people can relate to, not necessarily because they're like offensive and that they actually believe in like morally important things, but just because like they all come from and relate to like this kind of misunderstanding about PC culture. And I think starting from humor allows us to kind of understand and begin to trust one another, and then we can sort of move towards the direction of actually having difficult conversations about things that we might otherwise like just consider to be like PC. But something I would like to say to qualify this point is that there are times where like conservative forms of conservative ideology or liberal ideology can tend to lead to physical violence, in which case the language itself translates into concrete forms of like violence. And I think in that case, there's obviously a difference in that there's an importance in restricting those kinds of actions. But the important thing I think is to not conflate uh, sort of like physical violence with the like violent language, because I think violent language is something you can work through discourse. And the thing is that not conflating the two, and not passing judgment too quickly on people allows us to be able to kind of like see those differences and work through them.